Mr. President, I rise to speak about extending tax cuts to all Americans on income up to $250,000. Mr. President, I was presiding this Monday when one of my friends on the other side of the aisle was speaking on the floor, and he said with great conviction, and I quote, "We need to do everything to see that the deficit does not increase." Now, less than a week later, he will vote to increase the deficit by $700 billion. That's an impressive reversal, don't you think? Now, many of my colleagues on the other side ran for re-election this fall saying that the deficit is a cancer, that we owe it to our children and grandchildren to cut the deficit. Well, to them I say congratulations, because one of your first votes back, you're going to vote to put over $9,300 more debt on the head of every child in America. Way to go. And what is that for? To give an average tax cut of $100,000 to Americans making over $1 million a year. Now, my friends on this subject have been saying to us, haven't you learned the lesson of the election? I do not recall permanent tax cuts for millionaires being on any ballot. In fact, let's take a look at the exit polls conducted by Edison Research, the exclusive provider of the national election exit polls for all of the major TV networks and the Associated Press. In their poll, they found that roughly 60% of Americans wanted to end tax cuts for income over $250,000. And more recently, a Quinnipiac poll said that only 35% of Americans wanted the Bush tax cuts extended for those for income over $250,000. And of course, the American people feel this way. They know what's been happening over the last 20 years in this country. According to the Economic Policy Institute, during the past 20 years, 56% of all income growth went to the top 1% of households. Even more unbelievably, a third of all income growth went to just the top 1/10 of 1%. The wealthy have done extremely well for themselves over the past 20 years. Unfortunately, this is while the middle class has done decidedly worse. When you adjust for inflation, the median household income actually declined over the last decade. During those years, while the rich were getting richer, the rest of working America was struggling to keep up. We've been growing apart. And the American people know this. And now working Americans are forced to listen to Republicans as they demand everyone needs to share the pain. We're all in this together. The IRS published a study analyzing the tax returns of the wealthiest 400 Americans. Want to take a guess at what their average effective tax rate was? Just over 16.5%. Is that really sharing the pain? Are they really sharing the pain just like everybody else? Now, frankly, I'm a little tired of being lectured by my friends on the other side of the aisle on the deficit. We all know that Bill Clinton inherited the largest deficit in history from George H.W. Bush, and then handed George W. Bush the largest surplus in history. And then George W. Bush nearly doubled the national debt and also handed Barack Obama the largest deficit in history. And of course, my friends controlled the Congress for most of those Bush years. Now, today we're talking about how to get our economy going and keep deficits down at the same time. And what we're discussing right now is whether to restore the Clinton marginal tax rate on the very wealthiest of Americans. Now, I remember when he raised the tax rate on the top 2%. Republicans said that would kill the economy. Newt Gingrich, remember him? On August 5th, 1993, he said, quote, "I believe this will lead to a recession next year. This is the Democrat machine's recession, and each one of them will be held personally accountable," unquote. Senator Phil Gramm, remember him? He said, quote, "The Clinton plan is a one-way ticket to recession. This plan does not reduce the deficit, but it raises it and puts people out of work." Now, Governor-elect John Kasich said, "This plan will not work. If it was to work, then I'd have to become a Democrat." Congratulations, Ohio, on electing a Democratic governor. 22.7 million jobs and a giant surplus later, George W. Bush waltzes in the office and says, "Hey, we're running a surplus. The people deserve a tax cut." Now, let's recall what he said about his tax cut. He said over and over again, and I quote, "By far, the vast majority of the help goes to those at the bottom end of the economic ladder." Wow, that sounds like the bottom got a vast majority of the tax cuts, doesn't it? They didn't. Actually, the bottom 60% of Americans got just 14.7% of the Bush tax cuts. And the top 1% got 29.5% of the tax cuts, exactly double. Let me repeat that. The top 1% got double of what the bottom 60% got. The results of this new policy: massive deficits. Only 1 million new jobs over the 8 years of the Bush presidency. 1 million compared to 22.7 million during Clinton's 8 years. And now my friends in the minority want to go back to that discredited economic policy. The fig leaf here is small business. They attack us and say that not cutting taxes on the richest Americans will hurt small business. Well, it seems that to my friends, some small businesses are more important than others. Why did they block us for months on passing the Small Business Jobs Act, which gave tax cuts to small businesses and created a $30 billion line of credit for small businesses on Main Street? Why did they oppose the HIRE Act that gave large tax cuts to small businesses to encourage them to hire unemployed workers? Well, it seems that these aren't the small businesses that my friends are so concerned about. When you and I think about small businesses, we picture the mom and pop grocer down the street, Mr. President, and somewhere in Oregon or Minnesota, or maybe a hardware store or a small precision manufacturing operation. We have a lot of those in Minnesota. We probably think of them as small businesses because they are small. They probably have a few employees, one location, and make a modest but comfortable living doing it. And Republicans are trying to scare us into believing that the grocer and the hardware store owners will shutter their doors and fire people if we return the top 2 tax brackets to their previous levels. But That's simply not the case. In reality, only 3% of small businesses would be affected by this change. Yet you'll hear Republicans tout that these top 3% of businesses make up 50% of the total small business income. Well, that tells you one important thing, that those 3% of small businesses aren't really small businesses. Only under the broadest, most arbitrary of definitions are these businesses small. When many of my friends on the other side of the aisle talk about small businesses, they're including anybody who uses a flow-through business entity, so an S-corp or a partnership. They're not defining a small business by its size or profits or the number of people they employ. They're defining it on a technicality. Under their definition, Bechtel, the fifth largest company in the United States, is a small business. The Koch brothers, who run a petroleum company with nearly $100 billion in annual revenues, they are considered a small business. They're worth about $16 billion each. Law firm partners and Wall Street bond traders are considered small businesses. So really, Republicans are using the mom and pop grocery store to defend the continuation of these tax cuts, but in reality, the only people they're really helping are the Bechtels and the Kochs of the world, and maybe Derek Jeter, Inc., and he deserves every dollar he gets, and Mel Gibson, Inc., and maybe he's had a bad year, and other likely small business beneficiaries. And at the same time that Republicans are demanding unpaid-for tax cuts for the Koch brothers, they're insisting that we pay for a continuation of the emergency unemployment insurance program. They want to pay for it even though unemployment benefits have been shown to be an extremely effective stimulus, in fact, one of the most effective stimulus measures. Why? Because when unemployed workers get their checks for a couple $100, they go to their local mom and pop grocery store and buy food. They spend that money right away in their communities in real small businesses. It's the holidays. Can they afford to buy a small Christmas present for their kids? I'm worried that there are those among us who would say, no presents. So Republicans say that these unemployment benefits are too expensive and will add to the deficit. They demand that these unemployment benefits must be paid for. Tax cuts for the richest people in America, no need to pay for these. Adding $700 billion to the deficit, or actually $830 billion when you factor in the extra interest payments, well, that's no problem. You know, I hear my friends on the other side say we're going to have to make some hard choices. I agree. The deficit is a problem. And getting it under control will take shared sacrifice. There are a lot of Minnesotans who have to make hard choices now. Maybe it means giving up a second car. Maybe it means no summer camp for the kids. Some communities in Minnesota have had to go to a 4-day school week because there just isn't the money there. Some Minnesotans have been even harder hit. Their unemployment insurance was cut off earlier this week because of us. They've got a lot of hard choices right now. Where are they going to live if they can't pay their mortgage or their rent? Choices: food or medicine or heat. How do I give my kids anything resembling a Christmas. These are people who lost their jobs and desperately want to find work. But we can't pass unemployment insurance for them unless it's paid for. But for the owners of Bechtel or Price Waterhouse Coopers, yeah, Price Waterhouse Coopers is a small business too. Well, for them, the sky's the limit. You know, I'm Jewish. I don't know the New Testament all that well, but I do know Matthew. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of my brethren, you did for me. I went to a union hall not long ago, building trades. A carpenter came up to me. Big, strong guy, rough hands, big, calloused hands. Tears in his eyes. He's gotten just a little bit of work here and there over the last 18 months. He said to me, I never took unemployment insurance before. I hate it. But if it weren't for unemployment insurance, I wouldn't be in my house. Making tough choices means doing one thing and not another. And right now, we are faced with that choice. If we can't agree to help people like that carpenter and his family by continuing emergency unemployment benefits, how can we live with ourselves? How can we think that we're doing our jobs? The choice before us is clear this holiday season. Lend a hand to those who simply can't get by without the help. Or give $100,000 in average tax cuts to people making over $1 million. Where are our values? What are we doing here? It's almost Christmas. We'll be leaving here to go spend time with our families. We've got jobs. We've got great jobs. I think this is the greatest job, trying to make people's lives better back in Minnesota. That's my job. That's my job. So I asked my colleagues, what are we doing here? Thank you, Mr. President.